Okay, let's deal with the bad requests for the validation error and the bad request itself. And if we take a look at the console, the two different responses we're getting back here, let's just refresh the page and try this again. And if I click on these two different options, then we can see the difference between the two responses. They're both 400 codes, but in this case, the data object is just a string that contains "this is a bad request," and that's the message that we're passing back from our API. And we want to display this message in our toast. Now, in the validation error response, if we take a look at this, this is slightly different. This contains an errors object, and inside here is all the different validation errors. Now, what we typically want to do with validation errors, these are going to be sent back from our API, and it would be typically used inside a form where we're taking the inputs from the client and passing that to the API. If the API says, nope, we need more data, then it's going to send back this validation response, and it gives us the response in this kind of format. But what we'd normally want to do is display the validation errors on the component itself rather than displaying them in a toast. So let's take a look at how we can configure our agent.ts file to handle both of these kind of requests, or responses, I should say. So what we'll do is we'll remove this and we'll add an if statement. And what we'll do is we'll check to see if data contains that errors object. Now, if it does contain that errors object, then this is that validation errors response that we get back from the API. And we need to do something with this. So what we'll do is we'll store the different errors in a variable called model state errors. And we'll initialize this with an empty array. Now, what we want to do is we want to loop over all of the errors, push them into this new array that we're creating, so we have a single array. And then we want to flatten that array so that we just see the validation error strings rather than the surrounding objects that we have at the moment. So what we'll do is we'll say for const key in data.errors, and we'll check to see if we have data errors, and then we'll use the square brackets to look for this specific key inside data errors. And remember, the square brackets is the object property accessor syntax. And then what we'll do is we'll say model state errors dot push, and we'll say data errors, and then pass up the key, or use the key as what we're accessing here. And then what we'll do is we'll say throw model state errors, because we want to throw this back to the component, and then we'll use the flat method to flatten the array so that we just get the list of strings. And then we'll add an else condition, and we'll say toast.error, and then just pass in data as what we want to display. Now, if we go back and take a look at the difference this has made, and once again I'll refresh the page, and I'll open up the console. And if we just click the bad request, then we can see the text that we get back from the API. This is a bad request. And if we click on validation error, then we see undefined, but what we want to do here is go back to our test errors component, and instead of for the handle validation error function, instead of displaying error.response, we just want to display the error, because we're throwing back the model state errors as a single array now and not the full error object. So if we go back and take another look and click on validation error again, this time what we see is the array of the different validation errors. And we'll be able to easily use this inside our component to display the different errors. So what we'll do is we'll create a component to display validation errors, and we'll go back to VS Code, and inside the errors folder, let's create a new file, and we'll call it validation errors.tsx. And inside here what we'll do is we'll just import React from React, and we'll say export default function, and we'll say validation errors, and we'll take the errors as props in this case. So what we'll do is we'll create an interface above the function, call it props, just as we've done before, and we'll specify the errors are a type of string array. and then we'll specify props. So what we'll return in this case is we'll use the message component from Semantic UI and give it the type of error. And then we'll check to see if we've got some errors. So we'll say errors, double ampersand, and open parentheses, and then we'll use message.list, and then we'll loop over our errors. So we'll say errors.map, and we'll say ERR, and we'll just use type of any here. And then we'll open parentheses again, and we'll say message.item, and we need to give it a key. And the key in this case, what we'll do is add an additional parameter here and just use I, which is the index of the thing that we're looping over. So each array element has an index, and we can use that as our key if we're stuck for what to use as a key. And then we can just display the error inside our message.item. So this takes care of our validation errors component, and then what we can do is we can head back to our test error component, and what we'll do to demonstrate this is we'll just create some local state. So we'll say const errors, and we'll say set errors equals use state, and we'll set it to null initially. And then what we can do is scroll back down to our handle validation error function, and instead of logging to the console, we can say set errors and pass in the error. And then what we can do is just underneath this segment, we can check to see if we have errors, and then say double ampersand, and then we can say add our validation errors component. So we'll say validation errors, and we'll pass in the errors equals errors. And we're getting a warning to say that the type of null is not assignable to type of string. So we may or may not have the errors at this point, of course, so we need to go back to our validation errors component and tell the errors that it can be a string array or it can be null. And if we go back to our test error component, then the errors have gone away. And we can go and test the effects in our browser. So let's just once again refresh the page to get rid of that error. And if we click on validation error, now we see the list of validation errors in our component, and that's exactly what we're looking for. So we can use this in our form as well, just to display the errors that we get back from the API if we fail the validation on the API. So this takes care of the bad request and the validation error. What we'll take a look at next is the server error.